Every animal found its pair, every creature its place. But when the rain began, one was left behind, not because Noah forgot, but because God commanded it. This is the story of the creature that was never meant to survive the flood. The sound begins softly at first, a gentle pattering against stone, against wood, against the very fabric of the world. But listen closer. This isn't the comforting rhythm of spring rain or the brief summer shower that nourishes the earth. This is something else entirely. The drops fall heavier now, relentless, carrying with them the weight of divine judgment. The sky darkens not with the promise of renewal, but with the finality of an ending that has been decreed since the foundations of time itself. They came in pairs, lions with their golden manes catching the last light before the deluge, doves clutching olive branches that would one day symbolize hope, oxen with their patient eyes reflecting an ancient trust, serpents coiling through the gathering dusk with secrets older than Eden itself. The great procession moved toward the ark, each species answering a call that resonated deeper than instinct, deeper than survival. 2 by 2, they entered the vessel that would carry them across the waters of annihilation into a world reborn. But not all creation found refuge in that floating sanctuary. There was one creature left behind, a being too corrupted for salvation, too tainted by forbidden knowledge to deserve a place among the preserved. In the gathering storm, as the first drops of judgment began to fall, something watched from the shadows beyond the ark's protective light, something that had once been pure but was now an abomination, a living testament to the corruption that had spread across the face of the earth like a plague. The biblical account of Noah's Ark, recorded in Genesis chapters 6 through 9, speaks of a world so corrupted that divine patience had reached its limit. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, the scripture tells us, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. But the Hebrew text reveals something more specific, more disturbing. It speaks not merely of human wickedness, but declares that all flesh had corrupted its way upon the earth. All flesh, not just humanity, but the very fabric of created life itself. What kind of corruption could be so profound, so systemic, that it would require the complete destruction of the world? What darkness had spread so far that only a handful of the pure could be saved? The canonical scriptures hint at the answer, but it is in the ancient texts, the books that were known to the earliest communities of faith but later removed from common circulation, that we find the full, terrifying scope of what had transpired in those antediluvian days. The Book of Enoch, revered by the early church fathers and quoted directly in the New Testament epistle of Jude, preserves the forbidden knowledge of what transpired before the flood. It speaks of the Watchers, those divine beings who were appointed to observe humanity, but who instead chose to intervene in ways that violated the very order of creation. These celestial guardians, driven by desires that should have been foreign to their nature, descended from their heavenly posts and took mortal flesh as their brides. But their transgression did not end with humanity. The text reveals something far more disturbing, and they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, and to devour one another's flesh and drink the blood. The corruption spread beyond the union of divine and human. It infected the very animal kingdom itself, producing hybrid creatures that were neither fully natural nor supernatural, but something altogether wrong. Abominations that walked the earth as living violations of the divine order. The Book of Jubilees, another ancient text treasured by early Jewish and Christian communities, elaborates on this cosmic disaster. And lawlessness increased on the earth, and all flesh corrupted its way, alike men and cattle and beasts and birds and everything that walketh on the earth. Shock. The corruption was not metaphorical, but literal, biological, fundamental. It was a genetic and spiritual contamination that had spread through the very DNA of creation itself. And the earth was defiled through the blood of the giants, Enoch records. speaking of the Nephilim, the offspring of these forbidden unions. But these giants were not merely oversized humans. They were the first fruits of a corruption that would spread through interbreeding, through violence, through the systematic violation of the boundaries that God had established between species, between realms, between the sacred and the profane. Imagine the world as it existed in those final days before the flood. Picture creatures that should never have been, hybrid beasts with the cunning of angels and the appetites of demons, animals that had been twisted into forms that mocked their original design. The ancient texts speak of giants who consumed not just the fruits of the earth, but the earth's creatures, and finally, when those were exhausted, each other. They describe a world where the natural order had been so thoroughly violated that the very concept of species had become meaningless. This was the world that God looked upon and declared irredeemably corrupted. This was the creation that had to be washed clean, reset, begun again with only the pure remnant that remained untainted by the Watcher's rebellion. When God commanded Noah to bring 2 of every kind into the ark, the Hebrew word used is min, a term that refers not just to species, but to the original pure forms of life as they had been created. The instruction was specific: save only those creatures that remained as God had made them, untouched by the genetic and spiritual corruption that had spread across the earth like a contagion. This understanding transforms our entire perception of the flood narrative. Noah was not simply gathering animals for a rescue mission. He was conducting the most critical genetic preservation project in history, carefully selecting only those creatures that retained their original uncorrupted nature. The ark was not a zoo, but a seed bank, carrying the pure genetic material needed to restart creation itself. The ancient commentators understood this distinction. Rabbi Eleazar taught that God showed Noah each species individually, instructing him to take only those that came before him in their original form. The Midrash speaks of certain creatures being rejected from the ark, not because there was insufficient room, but because they bore the mark of corruption, the genetic signature of the Watcher's rebellion. The Jewish mystical tradition, preserved in texts like the Zohar and the writings of the medieval Kabbalists, speaks of the flood as more than a physical event. They describe it as a cosmic cleansing, a reset of the spiritual operating system of reality itself. The corrupted creatures were not merely killed, they were erased from the pattern of existence, their forms dissolved back into the primordial chaos from which all things emerge. Early Christian Apocrypha expands on this theme, describing the flood as a necessary surgery performed on the body of creation. Just as a physician must sometimes amputate diseased flesh to save the whole body, God was forced to cut away the corrupted portions of his creation to preserve what remained pure. The Church Fathers, including Origen, Augustine, and John Chrysostom, wrestled with the theological implications of this cosmic cleansing. They understood that the flood represented not just divine judgment, but divine mercy, the mercy of a creator who loved his creation so much that he was willing to destroy the corrupted portions to save the whole. But what of the creatures that were left behind? What became of those hybrid abominations that bore the genetic signature of angelic rebellion? The texts suggest that they were not merely casualties of the flood, but targets of it. They were the specific objects of divine wrath, the living embodiments of everything that had gone wrong with creation. Some traditions speak of these corrupted beings possessing a terrible intelligence, understanding exactly why they had been excluded from salvation. They knew that their very existence was a violation of divine law, that their hybrid nature made them unsuitable for the new world that would emerge from the waters. In their final moments, as the floodwaters rose around them, they cried out not for mercy, but in defiance, their voices adding to the cacophony of judgment that echoed across the dying world. The flood, then, was not simply about starting over. It was about restoration, returning creation to its intended state, wiping clean the genetic and spiritual graffiti that the Watchers had spray-painted across the canvas of existence. It was cosmic debugging, removing the corrupted code that had infected the program of reality. The waters that rose to cover the highest mountains were not merely H2O. They were the agents of purification, carrying within their depths the power to dissolve the unnatural bonds that held the corrupted creatures together. As they rose, they separated the pure from the impure, the original from the counterfeit, the blessed from the cursed. Consider the profound loneliness of those final days for the corrupted beings. As the waters rose higher and higher, they would have seen the ark floating safely above them, carrying the pure animals that would inherit the new world. They would have understood that they had no place in God's plan for the future, that their existence was a mistake that was being corrected. The ancient texts suggest that some of these creatures possessed prophetic knowledge, understanding not just their immediate fate, but the cosmic significance of their destruction. They knew that they were being erased not just from the physical world, but from the genetic memory of creation itself. Their forms would not appear in the new world. Their kinds would not be numbered among the species that would replenish the earth. In the rising waters, they saw not just death, but obsolescence, the universe itself declaring them to be errors that needed correction. They were living reminders of a rebellion that had failed, of a corruption that had been judged and found wanting. The theological implications are staggering. If certain creatures were indeed excluded from the ark because of their corrupted nature, then the flood represents more than just a reset of human civilization. It represents a fundamental editing of the book of life itself, a divine decision to remove certain chapters from the story of creation. This understanding casts the rainbow, God's sign to Noah after the flood, in a new light. It was not just a promise that the earth would never again be destroyed by water. It was a covenant that creation itself had been purified, that the corrupted genetic lines had been permanently severed, and that the new world would be built only upon the foundation of the pure. The rainbow became a symbol of genetic integrity, a sign that the boundaries between species would be maintained, that the natural order would be preserved, and that the kind of cosmic rebellion that had necessitated the flood would never again be permitted to corrupt the fabric of existence. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of this interpretation is what it suggests about the nature of corruption itself. If entire species could become so tainted by rebellion that they had to be removed from existence, what does that say about the power of sin to transform and corrupt? What does it suggest about the fragility of the natural order and the constant vigilance required to maintain it? The story becomes not just about judgment, but about the terrible responsibility of purity, the weight of being chosen to survive when others are deemed unworthy of salvation. Noah and his family, along with the animals in the ark, were not just survivors, but custodians of genetic and spiritual integrity for the entire future of creation. As the floodwaters began to recede and the ark came to rest upon the mountains of Ararat, the world that emerged was fundamentally different from the one that had been destroyed. It was a world scrubbed clean of genetic corruption, a creation returned to its original parameters, a universe rebooted with only the pure code remaining in its operating system. Perhaps the true lesson of the flood is not about what was saved, but what was never meant to survive, and the terrible mercy of a God who loved his creation enough to perform the most radical surgery imaginable to preserve its essential purity. Yet even as the waters began their inexorable rise, covering first the valleys, then the hills, then the very peaks of mountains, something else was happening in the depths of the earth itself. The ancient texts speak of chambers far beneath the surface, caverns that had been carved by beings whose understanding of stone and metal exceeded anything known to surface dwellers. Here, in the bowels of the earth, the most corrupted of the hybrid creatures had retreated, sensing perhaps through some twisted instinct that their time upon the surface was ending. The Book of Giants, fragments of which were discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, preserves haunting glimpses of these final moments. It describes the Nephilim and their offspring gathering in great underground halls, their voices echoing through caverns that had never known sunlight. They spoke in languages that were neither human nor angelic, but something altogether alien, tongues that had been corrupted along with their flesh. "We know our fate." The text records one of them saying, "We have seen it written in the movements of the stars, in the patterns of the blood, in the dreams that come to us in the deep places. The waters rise not to cleanse, but to erase. We are the error that must be corrected, the mistake that cannot be permitted to continue." But these beings, products of forbidden union between the divine and the mortal, possessed knowledge that pure creation had never been meant to carry. They understood the mechanics of existence itself, the hidden laws that governed the interaction between matter and spirit, between the seen and the unseen. In their final hours, as the flood waters seeped through cracks in the earth above them, they enacted rituals that would ensure their survival in forms that the purifying waters could not touch. The Slavonic Enoch, preserved in Eastern Orthodox traditions, speaks of these creatures binding their essence to objects that would outlast the flood. Stones carved with symbols that hurt to look upon, metals forged with techniques that violated the natural properties of matter itself. They created vessels for their consciousness that could endure beneath the waters, waiting for a time when the world above would again be ripe for corruption. This was their final act of rebellion, not acceptance of their fate, but defiance of it. If they could not survive in flesh, they would survive in other forms. If they could not corrupt this creation, they would wait for the next opportunity, the next moment when divine vigilance might falter and allow them to resurface. The implications of this understanding transform the entire narrative of the flood from a simple tale of divine judgment to a cosmic battle between order and chaos, between the pure and the corrupted, between creation as God intended it and creation as it had been twisted by rebellion. Consider what this means for our understanding of the world that emerged from the waters. Yes, it was cleansed of the immediate corruption, scrubbed clean of the hybrid abominations that had walked its surface. But deep beneath the earth, in places where the purifying waters never fully reached, something waited. The seeds of corruption had been planted not just in flesh, but in the very substance of the world itself. The rabbinical traditions speak of this in coded language, referring to the deep things that were not touched by the waters. They describe Noah's descendants discovering strange artifacts in the earth, objects that seemed to pulse with unnatural life, stones that whispered in languages that predated human speech, metals that grew warm to the touch and seemed to move of their own accord. These discoveries were not random. The corrupted beings had planned for this possibility, had prepared for a world that would emerge from the flood, carrying within it the hidden seeds of their eventual return. They had turned their destruction into a kind of diaspora, scattering their essence across the globe in forms that would lie dormant until the time was right for reawakening. The early Christian fathers understood this dimension of the flood narrative, though they spoke of it carefully, aware that such knowledge was dangerous. John Chrysostom wrote of the deep corruption that seeks always to rise, while Augustine warned of the ancient rebellion that sleeps but does not die. They recognized that the flood had won a battle but not the war, that the cosmic struggle between purity and corruption would continue in new forms. This perspective casts the post-flood world in an entirely different light. The rainbow was indeed a covenant, but it was also a warning, a reminder that divine vigilance was constant and necessary. The promise that the world would never again be destroyed by flood was coupled with the understanding that other forms of judgment might be required as the ancient corruption sought new avenues of expression. The descendants of Noah, carrying the pure genetic heritage of pre-flood creation, became unwitting guardians of this cosmic trust. They were not merely survivors, but custodians of a creation that remained under constant threat from forces that had learned to hide themselves in the very structure of reality. Archaeological evidence from the ancient world takes on new meaning when viewed through this lens. The megalithic structures that dot the globe, Baalbek, Sacsayhuaman, the pyramids themselves, were not merely monuments to human achievement, but defensive works, barriers erected against the possibility of the ancient corruption's return. The precision with which these structures were built, their alignment with celestial bodies, their use of acoustic properties that modern science barely understands, all suggest knowledge of forces that transcended purely human understanding. The builders of these monuments knew something that later generations forgot, that the world was not safe, that the flood had been only the first act in a drama that would continue to unfold across the millennia. They encoded warnings in stone, created geometric patterns that would serve as locks against doors that should never be opened, established bloodlines whose primary purpose was not rulership, but guardianship. This knowledge was passed down through carefully protected lineages, preserved in mystery schools and religious traditions that understood their role as keepers of cosmic secrets. The Egyptian priesthood, the Mesopotamian mages, the Hebrew Levites, all carried fragments of the pre-flood wisdom. All understood that their primary responsibility was not to their immediate communities, but to the integrity of creation itself. But knowledge, once lost, is difficult to recover. As generations passed and the immediate memory of the flood faded, the guardianship became ritual rather than reality. The warnings became myths, the protective measures became mere tradition, and the vigilance that had been purchased with the blood of the entire pre-flood world began to relax. The ancient texts describe this process with profound sadness, watching as humanity gradually forgot the true reason for their survival. The Book of Jubilees records, "And the children of Noah began to make war against each other, and to take captive each other, and to slay each other, and to shed the blood of men on the earth, and to eat blood, and to build strong cities, and walls, and towers, and individuals began to exalt themselves above the nation, and to found the beginnings of kingdoms, and to go to war people against people, and nation against nation, and city against city, and all began to do evil, and to acquire arms, and to teach their sons war, and they began to capture cities, and to sell male and female slaves." The corruption was returning, not in the dramatic form of hybrid giants, but in the subtler poison of moral degradation, spiritual rebellion, and the gradual erosion of the boundaries that God had established for human behavior. The pure genetic heritage that had been preserved in the Ark was being polluted once again, not through angelic intervention, but through human choice. This cycle of corruption and cleansing would repeat throughout history, each time requiring new forms of divine intervention. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, the conquest of Canaan, the Babylonian exile, all can be understood as smaller-scale repetitions of the flood principle, surgical strikes against corruption that threaten to spread beyond containment. The pattern reveals itself across the biblical narrative. Corruption emerges, spreads, reaches a critical threshold, and is then surgically removed to preserve the integrity of the whole. Each time, a remnant is preserved. Abraham, Moses, David, the returning exiles, carrying forward the pure lineage and the sacred knowledge needed to maintain cosmic order. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this understanding is what it suggests about our own time. If the flood was indeed a cosmic reset designed to eliminate corrupted genetic lines and spiritual rebellion, and if the corrupted beings found ways to preserve their essence beyond the reach of the purifying waters, then their influence would necessarily grow stronger over time. The modern world, with its unprecedented technological capabilities, its manipulation of genetic codes, its blurring of boundaries between species and even between organic and artificial life, bears troubling resemblances to the pre-flood world described in the ancient texts. We are once again approaching the threshold where all flesh is corrupting its way upon the earth, where the natural order is being systematically violated in pursuit of knowledge and power that transcends divine boundaries. The question becomes not whether divine judgment will come again, but in what form it will manifest. The covenant of the rainbow promised that the world would not again be destroyed by flood, but it said nothing about other forms of cosmic correction. Fire, earthquake, plague, the collapse of civilization itself, all remain within the parameters of divine justice for a world that has forgotten its purpose and abandoned its guardianship. The ancient texts speak of a final cleansing that will make the flood seem gentle by comparison, a time when not just corrupted flesh but corrupted spirit will be purged from creation. They describe it not as destruction, but as transformation, a metamorphosis of reality itself that will separate the pure from the impure with surgical precision. In this light, the story of Noah's Ark becomes not just historical narrative, but prophetic warning. The animal that Noah didn't save, that corrupted creature left behind in the rising waters, represents more than ancient history. It represents the ongoing choice that faces every generation, every individual, every moment of moral decision. We are all, in our way, standing at the entrance to the ark, being evaluated not by our species, but by our spiritual DNA, not by our external appearance, but by our essential nature. The question is not whether we will be judged, but whether we will be found worthy of preservation when the next cleansing comes. The sound of rain continues to fall, heavier now, more insistent. But this time, we must ask ourselves, when the waters rise again, will we be among those carried safely in the ark of divine protection, or will we find ourselves among the corrupted creation that was never meant to survive? The rain continues its relentless descent, each drop carrying within it the memory of that first great deluge. But as we peer deeper into the forbidden texts, as we excavate the buried truths that mainstream theology has long avoided, we discover that the corruption Noah witnessed was far more extensive and far more terrifying than we have been taught to believe. The Aramaic fragments discovered in the caves of Qumran speak of something that chills the blood even now, thousands of years after the waters receded. They describe creatures that had learned to wear the faces of the pure, shapeshifters that could mimic the appearance of untainted beasts while carrying within their cells the genetic signature of rebellion. These were not merely hybrid abominations, they were cosmic infiltrators, living lies that threatened to contaminate the very process of salvation itself. "Beware the false forms," one fragmentary text warns, "for the corrupted ones learned the art of deception from their fathers, the Watchers. They present themselves as clean beasts, but their blood runs black with the poison of the first rebellion." The implication is staggering. Even among those animals that appeared suitable for the ark, some carried hidden corruption, genetic time bombs that could explode into chaos in the new world. This revelation transforms our understanding of Noah's selection process from a simple gathering to something far more sophisticated. A cosmic quality control operation that required supernatural discernment. The Hebrew word tamim, used to describe Noah himself as perfect in his generations, carries implications that extend far beyond moral character. It suggests genetic purity, an unblemished bloodline that had somehow remained untouched by the spreading contamination. The Syriac book of the Cave of Treasures elaborates on this theme, describing Noah as possessing what it calls the sight of the pure, the ability to perceive the spiritual DNA of living creatures, to see through the deceptions that had become commonplace in the corrupted world. This was not a gift, but a burden, requiring him to look into the very essence of each creature and determine whether it carried the seed of destruction or the promise of redemption. Imagine the weight of such responsibility. Standing at the threshold of his great vessel, Noah would have faced creatures that appeared identical to the untrained eye. Two lions that looked the same in every physical detail, yet one carried the pure genetic heritage of creation, while the other bore the invisible mark of angelic rebellion. The choice between them would determine not just which animals survived the flood, but what kind of world would emerge from the waters. The ancient commentaries describe moments of almost unbearable tension during this selection process. The Midrash speaks of certain animals that cried out in voices that were not their own, revealing their corrupted nature only at the moment of potential salvation. These beings had learned to mimic not just the appearance but the behavior of pure creatures, yet under the pressure of divine scrutiny, their true nature emerged. And there came to the ark creatures that seemed fair to look upon, one text records, but their breath was as the breath of corpses, and their eyes held the light of stars that had fallen from their courses. These Noah turned away, though his heart was grieved, for he knew that mercy to the corrupted would be cruelty to the pure. The psychological toll of such decisions becomes evident in the later descriptions of Noah's character. The man who emerged from the ark was fundamentally different from the one who had entered it. He had witnessed the complete moral collapse of the world, had been forced to exclude beings that might once have been pure, and had carried the genetic future of all life through nearly a year of floating above a drowned planet. The wine that he would later plant and consume was not mere agriculture. It was medicine, a desperate attempt to numb the memory of what he had seen and done. But the most disturbing revelation in these ancient texts concerns what happened to those creatures that were rejected from the ark. They did not simply die when the waters rose. According to the Book of Giants, they gathered in great congregations as the rain began to fall, and in their final hours, they performed rituals that would echo through the corridors of history like cursed prayers. They called upon the names that should not be spoken, the text records, and they made covenants with powers that exist in the spaces between spaces. Though their flesh would perish, they ensured that their essence would endure, sleeping in the deep places until the world should again be ready to receive their poison. These corrupted beings, facing extinction, chose to transform their destruction into a form of cosmic seed banking. They embedded their spiritual DNA into the very fabric of the earth itself, creating what the texts describe as wells of corruption that would remain sealed beneath the floodwaters, but would not be destroyed by them. The implications of this understanding reverberate through every subsequent age of human history. The flood was not the end of the corruption, but merely its temporary suppression. Like a disease driven into remission, the ancient rebellion would seek new avenues of expression, new hosts to carry its influence forward through time. The post-flood world, therefore, was not the paradise of renewal that we might expect, but a cosmic battlefield where the pure genetic heritage preserved in the ark would face constant assault from the dormant corruption seeking to reawaken. This explains the seemingly inexplicable appearance of giants in the land of Canaan, the mysterious Nephilim who appear in numbers despite supposedly being destroyed in the flood. There were giants in the earth in those days, Genesis tells us, speaking of the pre-flood world, and also after that. The phrase "after that" has puzzled theologians for millennia, but the ancient texts provide a chilling explanation. The corruption found a way to survive the flood, not in flesh, but in essence, waiting for the right conditions to manifest once again in physical form. The Hebrew term Nephilim itself carries layers of meaning that have been obscured by translation. While commonly rendered as giants, the root word naphal means to fall or to cast down. These were not merely large humans, but fallen ones, beings whose very existence represented a cosmic declension from the original order of creation. The Book of Jubilees describes the gradual reemergence of this corruption in the generations following the flood. And in the third week of this Jubilee, the unclean demons began to lead astray the children of the sons of Noah, and to make to air and destroy them. The pure genetic lines that had been preserved with such care began to face new forms of contamination, subtler perhaps than the direct intervention of the Watchers, but no less deadly in their ultimate effects. This pattern of corruption and cleansing would establish the rhythm of biblical history. Each time the genetic and spiritual contamination reached a critical threshold, divine intervention would be required to prevent the complete collapse of the pure lineage. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, the command to exterminate the Canaanite tribes, even the Babylonian exile, all can be understood as surgical strikes against corruption that threaten to spread beyond containment. The rabbinical tradition preserves disturbing details about these later manifestations of the ancient corruption. The Talmud speaks of creatures found in the ruins of destroyed cities that were neither beast nor man, but something that partook of both natures in ways that violated the order of creation. These beings were not random mutations, but the successful re-emergence of the hybrid genetics that should have died in the flood. The medieval Jewish mystics went further, describing a hidden war that had raged throughout history between the children of the Ark, those creatures and bloodlines that had been preserved in purity, and the spawn of the deep, the corrupted essences that had found new forms of manifestation in the post-flood world. This understanding casts the entire biblical narrative in a new light. The chosen people were not simply recipients of divine favor, but guardians of genetic and spiritual purity in a world under constant assault from forces seeking to corrupt and destroy the original order of creation. Their laws, their rituals, their strict prohibitions against mixing with surrounding peoples, all were defensive measures against contamination that posed not just cultural, but cosmic threats. The kosher laws, viewed from this perspective, become more than dietary restrictions. They become genetic protection protocols, designed to prevent the consumption of creatures that might carry hidden corruption. The prohibition against mixing fabrics, against crossbreeding animals, against the countless forms of mixture that Levitical law forbids, all can be understood as attempts to maintain the boundaries that the flood had restored. The sacrificial system itself takes on new meaning when viewed through this lens. The requirement for perfect sacrifices, animals without blemish or defect, was not merely about offering the best to God, but about ensuring that only genetically pure creatures were used in rituals that were designed to maintain the cosmic order. The priesthood, with its strict hereditary requirements and elaborate purity codes, served as a kind of spiritual immune system for the human race, identifying and neutralizing sources of contamination before they could spread through the population. The high priest's breastplate, with its 12 stones representing the tribes of Israel, was not mere ornamentation but a genetic monitoring device, a way of maintaining awareness of the spiritual health of the chosen bloodlines. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this interpretation is what it suggests about the nature of evil itself. If the corrupted creatures left behind in the flood were able to preserve their essence in forms that could survive the purification of the waters, then evil is not merely the absence of good, but a positive force with its own intelligence, its own agenda, its own methods of persistence and propagation. The ancient texts describe this force as having learned from its defeat in the flood, becoming more subtle in its methods, more patient in its planning, more deceptive in its presentation. Rather than manifesting as obvious abominations, it learned to work through seemingly normal creatures and people, corrupting from within rather than conquering from without. This evolution of evil strategy explains the increasing emphasis on discernment that characterizes later biblical writings. The ability to distinguish between the pure and the corrupted, between the genuinely holy and the convincingly counterfeit, becomes the essential survival skill for those charged with maintaining the integrity of creation. The prophetic literature is filled with warnings about false prophets, lying signs and wonders, deceptions so convincing that even the elect might be deceived. These are not random warnings, but specific alerts about the methods that the ancient corruption would use in its attempts to regain dominance over creation. The figure of the serpent in Eden takes on new significance when viewed from this perspective. The creature that tempted Eve was not merely a talking animal, but potentially the first successful manifestation of the corruption that would later necessitate the flood. Its ability to speak, to reason, to tempt with sophisticated arguments suggests a being that had already crossed the boundaries between the animal and the angelic, between the created and the rebellious. The curse pronounced upon the serpent, that it would crawl on its belly and eat dust all the days of its life, may not have been merely punitive but preventive, a way of ensuring that this particular form of corruption could not easily spread to other creatures. The serpent became a kind of genetic dead end, its hybrid nature trapped in a form that could not easily reproduce or adapt. Yet even in this cursed state, the serpent retained enough of its original corruption to serve as a symbol and a warning throughout the rest of biblical history. Its appearance in the wilderness as the bronze serpent lifted up by Moses, its role in the apocalyptic imagery of Revelation, all suggest a creature whose corrupted nature made it uniquely suitable as both symbol and instrument of the ongoing cosmic conflict. The flood, therefore, represents not just a historical event but a cosmic principle, the necessity of periodic cleansing to prevent the complete triumph of corruption over creation. The rainbow that appears at the end of the narrative is not merely a sign of God's promise never again to destroy the world by water, but a reminder that the battle between purity and corruption would continue in other forms, requiring other methods of resolution. The colors of the rainbow itself carry symbolic meaning in this context. White light, representing the pure unity of divine creation, is separated into its component colors, just as creation itself had been separated into pure and corrupted elements. The rainbow serves as a constant reminder that what appears unified on the surface may contain hidden divisions, that what seems pure may carry within it the seeds of corruption. This understanding transforms our reading of every subsequent biblical narrative. The Tower of Babel, the destruction of the cities of the plain, the conquest of Canaan, the Babylonian exile, all become chapters in the ongoing story of corruption and cleansing that began with the flood and continues to the present day. The ancient texts suggest that this cycle will continue until a final cleansing that will make the flood seem gentle by comparison. They speak of a time when not just corrupted flesh, but corrupted spirit will be purged from creation, when the very fabric of reality will be rewoven to exclude the possibility of rebellion. In that final cleansing, the texts promise there will be no ark, no remnant preserved, no opportunity for corruption to hide and wait for another chance. The pure and the corrupted will be separated with absolute finality, and the cosmic experiment that began in Eden will reach its ultimate resolution. Until that time, the story of Noah and the flood serves as both historical record and prophetic warning. It reminds us that the battle between order and chaos, between purity and corruption, between creation as God intended it and creation as it has been twisted by rebellion, continues in every generation, in every choice, in every moment when we must decide which side of the ark we will stand on when the waters rise again. The rain falls still, and in its rhythm we hear the echo of that first great storm that cleansed the world of its corrupted inhabitants. But we also hear the promise of another storm coming, one that will finish what the flood began, when every creature that was never meant to survive will finally face its ultimate judgment. Face its ultimate judgment. The sound grows louder now, no longer the gentle patter of an evening shower, but the thunderous roar of judgment itself. In that relentless downpour, we begin to understand that the creature left behind, that singular abomination excluded from Noah's Ark, was not merely one animal among many, but something that represented the very essence of what had gone wrong with creation itself. The ancient Ethiopic text, known as First Enoch, preserved in the mountain monasteries of Ethiopia and revered by the early church, provides us with a description so vivid and disturbing that later translators would often soften its language or omit entire passages. It speaks of a creature that had once been among the most beautiful of God's creations, but which had become the willing vessel for the Watcher's most ambitious experiment in genetic manipulation. In those days, the text records with clinical precision, there arose a beast that bore the face of a man, the wings of an eagle, the strength of a lion, and the cunning of the serpent. But its heart was filled with the knowledge of forbidden things, and its voice could speak words that should not be spoken by any creature under heaven. This was not merely another hybrid. This was the masterpiece of corruption, the living embodiment of everything that the Watchers had sought to achieve in their rebellion against divine order. The creature possessed what the ancient texts describe as the memory of heaven, a twisted recollection of its original nature before the corruption took hold. This made its rebellion not merely instinctual, but deliberate, informed by an understanding of exactly what it was rejecting. It knew what purity felt like, what divine order meant, and it chose corruption anyway, becoming not just a victim of the Watcher's experiments, but an active participant in the cosmic rebellion. The Hebrew fragments discovered among the Cairo Geniza, that treasure trove of medieval Jewish manuscripts, contain references to this creature that chill the blood even in translation. They call it Hanavel Harishon, the first fool, not because it lacked intelligence, but because it possessed so much knowledge that it chose foolishness, so much understanding that it embraced ignorance, so much potential for good that it deliberately selected evil. It walked among the pure beasts as one of them, these texts record, teaching them songs that should not be sung, showing them paths that should not be walked, opening their eyes to sights that should remain unseen. Through its influence, the corruption spread like oil upon water, touching everything, staining everything, destroying the very possibility of return to innocence. The creature's method of corruption was not violent coercion, but seduction through knowledge. It offered other animals glimpses of consciousness that transcended their nature, awareness that exceeded their design, appetites that violated their created purpose. The texts describe how it would appear to a pride of lions and teach them to crave not just the flesh of their prey, but the experience of terror in their victims' eyes. It showed eagles how to use their gift of flight not for hunting, but for surveillance, turning them into spies against their own kind. Most disturbing of all, it taught the domestic animals, the very creatures that lived in closest harmony with humanity, to question their purpose, to resent their service, to dream of rebellion. The peaceful oxen began to eye their masters with calculation rather than trust. The faithful dogs started to howl in harmonies that sounded like human screams. The gentle sheep developed a taste for meat and began to stalk their own lambs with predatory intent. This was corruption, not as violence, but as education, the systematic teaching of created beings to violate their own nature, to transcend the boundaries that God had established for their flourishing, to seek knowledge and experience that would ultimately destroy them. The creature was, in effect, conducting a master class in cosmic rebellion, using its own transformation as both lesson plan and cautionary tale. The Book of Jubilees provides additional context that illuminates the full scope of this educational corruption. And in those days, the beasts began to speak with human voices, and the birds began to reason like men, and the fish began to swim in patterns that spelled out words in languages that predated the confusion of Babel. The natural order was not merely being violated, it was being systematically inverted, with each species being taught to aspire to natures that were fundamentally incompatible with their created design. The creature itself served as living proof that such transcendence was possible, that the boundaries between species, between earthly and heavenly, between created and creative, could be crossed. But its very existence also demonstrated the cost of such crossing, the loss of peace, of purpose, of the simple joy that comes from fulfilling one's intended role in the cosmic order. Ancient Mesopotamian texts, predating the biblical narrative by centuries, contain references to a similar being that they called Anzu, a creature of immense power and knowledge that sought to steal the tablets of destiny from the gods themselves. These tablets represented not just divine authority, but the fundamental laws that governed the operation of reality. The parallels with the Genesis account are too striking to ignore, suggesting that memories of this creature and its rebellion had spread far beyond the boundaries of Hebrew tradition. The Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh contains a haunting passage that may refer to the same entity. There came to the wild places a beast that was more than beast, that spoke with the voice of gods but carried in its heart the poison of the void. It offered knowledge to all who would listen, but the price of its teaching was the loss of all that made listening worthwhile. What emerges from these cross-cultural references is a picture of a creature that was not merely corrupted, but actively corrupting, not simply fallen, but deliberately falling, not just excluded from salvation, but constitutionally incapable of accepting it. This being had become so thoroughly identified with rebellion that redemption would require not just forgiveness, but complete annihilation of its essential nature. The theological implications are staggering. If such a creature could exist, a being so corrupted that even divine mercy could not reach it, then corruption itself must be understood not as mere moral failure, but as ontological disaster, a fundamental alteration of the very substance of existence itself. The creature represented the possibility that rebellion could become so complete that it transformed the rebel into something that was no longer eligible for the mercy it had rejected. This understanding casts the flood in an entirely new light. It was not merely judgment upon sin, but surgery upon reality itself, the removal of a cancer that had metastasized through the entire body of creation. The creature left behind was not just one animal among many, but the source of the infection, the original carrier of the virus that had spread to all flesh upon the earth. The ancient commentators understood this distinction with crystalline clarity. The Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, an Aramaic translation and commentary on the Torah that preserves very early interpretative traditions, states bluntly, "There was one among the beasts that had learned to hate its own nature, and through this hatred it taught all others to despise the gifts they had been given. This one was not forgotten by the Holy One, blessed be He, but was remembered for destruction, for its existence had become a blasphemy against the very concept of creation." The creature's exclusion from the ark was not arbitrary divine cruelty, but cosmic necessity. Its presence among the saved would have been like including a virus in a genetic preservation bank, guaranteeing that the new world would eventually face the same corruption that had necessitated the flood in the first place. The mercy shown to the pure required the exclusion of the corrupted, just as the healing of a body sometimes requires the amputation of a diseased limb. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this interpretation is what it suggests about the nature of choice itself. The creature had not been created corrupted, it had chosen corruption so completely that it became incapable of choosing anything else. Its exclusion from salvation was not imposed from without, but generated from within, the inevitable result of decisions that had progressively narrowed its options until only rebellion remained possible. This transforms our understanding of the flood from a story about divine judgment to a meditation on the terrible freedom that God had built into creation, the freedom to choose not just individual acts of rebellion, but rebellion as an identity, corruption as a way of being, evil as a fundamental orientation of the soul. The creature represented the ultimate expression of this freedom, the choice to become something that was inherently choosable only for destruction. The early church fathers wrestled with these implications in their commentaries on the flood narrative. Jerome, in his translation of Hebrew texts into Latin, noted that certain passages were too terrible for common reading and should be reserved for those whose faith is strong enough to bear the weight of absolute truth. He was referring specifically to descriptions of the excluded creature and what its existence implied about the nature of evil and the limits of divine mercy. Augustine, in his City of God, addressed the theological problem more directly. There is a corruption so complete that it ceases to be corruption and becomes a new kind of nature, a nature that exists solely to oppose the good, to mock the pure, to serve as a living contradiction to everything that God intended creation to be. Such corruption cannot be redeemed, because redemption would require it to become something other than what it has chosen to be. And that choice has become so fundamental to its existence that change would be equivalent to annihilation. This Augustinian insight helps explain why the creature's exclusion from the ark was not merely practical, but ontological. It had become something that was definitionally incompatible with salvation, not because God's mercy was limited, but because the creature had systematically destroyed within itself everything that could receive mercy. It was like trying to pour water into a container that had chosen to become a sieve. The problem was not with the water, but with the container's fundamental inability to hold what was being offered. The mystical traditions of Judaism preserved even more disturbing details about the creature's final moments. The Zohar, that foundational text of Jewish mystical thought, describes the scene as the floodwaters began to rise. The beast that had taught corruption stood upon the highest mountain and sang songs of such beauty that even the angels wept to hear them. But the beauty was itself corrupted, for it was the beauty of what had been lost, not what could be restored. It sang not from love, but from spite, not to praise creation, but to mourn its passing, not to seek forgiveness, but to ensure that its rebellion would be remembered, even when its flesh was forgotten. This image of the creature as a kind of anti-psalmist, using its remaining gifts not for worship, but for mockery, not for praise, but for lament, captures something essential about the nature of ultimate corruption. It does not simply reject the good. It uses the good as a weapon against itself, turning even beauty and truth into instruments of rebellion and despair. The final moments described in these mystical texts are almost unbearable to contemplate. As the waters rose around the creature's last refuge, it began to teach the very stones and trees around it to share in its rebellion. The texts describe rocks beginning to crack in patterns that spelled out blasphemies, trees twisting their branches into shapes that mocked the sacred geometries of creation, even the earth itself beginning to convulse in rhythms that echoed the creature's corrupted heartbeat. It would not die alone, the Zohar records with characteristic understatement. If it could not corrupt the new world that would emerge from the waters, it would ensure that the old world would die as corrupted as possible, leaving scars upon the very fabric of reality that would persist long after its flesh had dissolved. This was the creature's final act of rebellion, not acceptance of its fate, but an attempt to maximize the damage of its destruction, to ensure that even in death it would serve as a source of contamination for whatever came after. The floodwaters were not just drowning the creature, but actively fighting against its attempts to poison even the agent of its own destruction. The battle between the rising waters and the creature's final corruption represents, in miniature, the cosmic conflict between order and chaos, between creation and destruction, between the divine intention and the rebellious will that had set itself against that intention. The flood was not just washing away the corrupted world. It was actively cleansing it, separating the pure from the impure, the redeemable from the irredeemable, the blessed from the cursed. In the end, the creature's exclusion from the ark becomes not just a historical detail, but a theological necessity, not just divine judgment, but cosmic mercy. Mercy to the pure creation that would have been contaminated by its presence. Mercy to the future world that would have inherited its rebellion. Mercy even to the creature itself, which was released from an existence that had become nothing but suffering and spite. The sound of the rain continues, but now we hear within it not just judgment but also cleansing, not just ending but also beginning, not just the death of the corrupted but also the birth of the pure. The creature that Noah didn't save was not forgotten by God but remembered in exactly the way that ultimate rebellion must be remembered, as a cautionary tale, a warning, a reminder of what happens when the gift of freedom is used to choose its own destruction. And perhaps that is the most profound lesson of all, that mercy and judgment are not opposites, but partners in the divine economy, that love sometimes requires exclusion, that salvation sometimes demands that certain things remain unsaved. The creature left behind in the rising waters serves as an eternal reminder that while God's mercy is infinite, it is not indiscriminate, and that the freedom to choose corruption ultimately includes the freedom to choose exclusion from everything that makes existence worthwhile. The waters rise, the rain continues, and somewhere in their depths lies the answer to the question that haunts every human heart. When the final accounting comes, when the ultimate choice must be made between salvation and rebellion, between purity and corruption, between the ark of divine protection and the rising waters of cosmic justice, which side will we choose, and what kind of creature will our choices have made us? The sound of rain grows heavier now, each drop carrying the weight of prophecy unfulfilled. In the gathering darkness, as the final moments before total submersion approach, we must confront the most disturbing possibility of all, that the creature's exclusion was not the end of its influence, but merely the beginning of its true purpose. For in those last moments, as the waters closed over its corrupted form, something far more terrible than death occurred: transformation. The Slavonic Enoch, preserved in the monasteries of Eastern Europe and hidden from common view for centuries, contains passages that were deemed too dangerous for general circulation. These texts speak of the creature's final metamorphosis, describing how its physical death became a spiritual birth of sorts, not into redemption, but into a new form of existence that transcended the boundaries between life and death, between presence and absence. When the waters covered the beast that had been first among the corrupted, the text records with clinical precision, its flesh dissolved, but its essence remained, becoming as a seed that would lie dormant in the deep places of the earth until the time of its sprouting should come. This was not mere poetic language, but a literal description of what the ancient writers believed had occurred. The creature had found a way to survive its own destruction. The implications of this transformation ripple through the entire post-flood narrative like cracks in a foundation. If the creature had indeed managed to preserve its essence beyond physical death, then every subsequent manifestation of corruption in the biblical account takes on new significance. The giants that appear in Canaan despite the flood's supposed destruction of all corrupted flesh, the strange hybrid creatures described in the visions of Ezekiel and Daniel, even the serpentine imagery that pervades apocalyptic literature, all begin to make sense as echoes of an influence that had never truly been eliminated. The medieval Jewish commentators approached this possibility with profound unease. The Tosafot, those supplementary commentaries that surrounded the text of the Talmud like a fortress of interpretation, contain veiled references to the presence that sleeps beneath the waters and the voice that speaks from the depths of the earth. These were not metaphors, but attempts to grapple with the theological horror of an evil so persistent that even divine judgment could not fully erase it. Rabbi Nachmanides, writing in the 13th century, addressed this mystery with characteristic directness. There is a corruption that becomes so essential to a creature's being that destroying the creature does not destroy the corruption. Instead, the corruption learns to exist without the creature, becoming a kind of spiritual parasite that seeks new hosts, new vessels, new opportunities for manifestation. His words carry the weight of someone who had studied texts that most of his contemporaries never saw, fragments of ancient wisdom too dangerous for casual scholarship. The Kabbalistic tradition took this understanding even further, developing an entire cosmology around what they called the kelipot, the broken shells or husks that remained after divine light had withdrawn from corrupted vessels. According to this system, the creature excluded from the ark had become the archetypal kelipa, the primary husk that would serve as a template for all subsequent manifestations of spiritual corruption. The Zohar describes this process with imagery that borders on the nightmarish. The beast that could not enter the ark became the ark of all that could not enter heaven. Its broken form became a vessel for every rebellion that would follow, every corruption that would seek to rise again from the depths of judgment. The creature had transformed from a single corrupted being into a kind of spiritual infrastructure for evil itself. This interpretation casts the entire sweep of biblical history in a new and terrifying light. The golden calf in the wilderness, with its mysterious power to inspire instant and total devotion among the Israelites, begins to make sense as more than mere idolatry. The text describes how Aaron took the gold from their hands and fashioned it with a graving tool, but it does not explain the source of the design or the reason for its immediate and overwhelming appeal. The ancient commentators, however, preserved disturbing details about the calf's construction. The Midrash speaks of Aaron being guided by a hand that was not his own, and of the gold itself taking shape according to patterns that were already written in the darkness. The implication is clear. The golden calf was not an original creation, but a manifestation of something far older, a physical echo of the corrupted creature whose essence had learned to work through metal and human hands. The serpent that tempts Eve in Eden takes on new significance when viewed through this lens. Rather than being the beginning of corruption, it becomes a manifestation of something that had always existed in potential, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The creature excluded from the ark had not been the first corrupted being, but the most successful, the one that had learned to embed its influence so deeply in the fabric of creation that it could manifest across time and space, appearing whenever and wherever the conditions were right for its emergence. The prophetic literature becomes a chronicle of this ongoing manifestation. Isaiah's vision of the seraph with 6 wings, covering its face and feet while crying, "Holy, holy, holy," reads differently when we consider that it might have been describing not an angel, but the corrupted creature's attempt to mimic angelic worship, a performance of holiness that barely concealed the rebellion beneath. Ezekiel's bizarre visions of wheels within wheels, creatures with multiple faces, and beings that moved without turning, begin to make sense as encounters with manifestations of the excluded creature's essence. These were not divine revelations, but cosmic intrusions, moments when the boundary between the purified world and the realm of the permanently corrupted wore thin enough to allow glimpses of what lay beyond. The book of Daniel's description of the 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, and strong exceedingly, with teeth of iron and 10 horns, reads like a prophetic vision of the creature's ultimate manifestation at the end of time. This was not a political empire, but the final physical form that the excluded essence would take when the constraints that had held it in check since the flood were finally removed. The New Testament's imagery of the dragon, the beast from the sea, and the false prophet forms a trilogy that corresponds perfectly with the ancient descriptions of the creature's threefold nature: its original corruption, its survival through the flood, and its final manifestation at the end of days. The Apocalypse of John becomes not just a vision of future events, but a revelation of the creature's true identity and ultimate destiny. The early church fathers understood these connections with varying degrees of clarity. Irenaeus, writing in the 2nd century, spoke of the ancient serpent that was excluded from the ark, but not from the world, while Tertullian described the beast that learned to survive its own destruction and to speak through the mouths of those who had never seen its face. These were not poetic metaphors, but theological observations about the nature of evil itself. The Gnostic texts, though rejected by Orthodox Christianity, preserved even more explicit descriptions of the creature's survival and ongoing influence. The Gospel of Philip speaks of the archon that was denied passage on the vessel of salvation, but found other means of crossing the waters, while the secret book of John describes the false creator that seeks to remake the world in its own corrupted image, using the tools of those who believe themselves to be building the kingdom of heaven. These Gnostic insights, however heretical they may have been deemed by later church councils, point to a truth that Orthodox theology has always struggled to address: the problem of evil's persistence in a world that has supposedly been cleansed by divine judgment. If the flood truly destroyed all corruption, why does corruption continue to emerge? If the pure genetic lines were successfully preserved in the ark, why do we continue to see manifestations of the hybrid nature that should have been eliminated? The answer suggested by the ancient texts is both simple and terrifying. The creature's exclusion from the ark was not its defeat, but its graduation to a higher form of existence. By learning to survive without flesh, it had transcended the limitations that constrained other forms of corruption. It no longer needed to inhabit a single body or manifest through a single species. It had become a kind of spiritual virus, capable of infecting any vessel that was willing to receive its influence. This understanding transforms our reading of human history itself. The recurring patterns of corruption, the cyclical nature of moral collapse and renewal, the tendency for civilizations to reach heights of achievement only to descend into decadence and destruction, all begin to make sense as manifestations of the creature's ongoing influence. The Tower of Babel, with its sudden appearance of unified human ambition to make a name for ourselves and reach unto heaven, reads like a description of the creature's first successful post-flood manifestation through human consciousness. The builders were not merely arrogant, they were infected, carrying within their minds the echo of the creature's original rebellion against divine authority. The giants that appear throughout the Old Testament, Goliath, Og of Bashan, the sons of Enoch, were not random genetic anomalies, but evidence that the creature's essence had found ways to influence human reproduction, recreating in new forms the hybrid nature that had been excluded from salvation. The mystery religions that flourished throughout the ancient world, with their emphasis on secret knowledge, transformation through ritual corruption, and the deliberate violation of natural boundaries, were not independent developments, but manifestations of the creature's educational program, continuing in new forms. The same curriculum that had been taught to the antediluvian world was being offered again, adapted for new students, but fundamentally unchanged in its essential corruption. The Roman Empire's systematic persecution of early Christianity takes on new significance when viewed through this lens. It was not merely political opposition, but spiritual recognition. The creature's essence, working through imperial power structures, instinctively recognized the threat posed by a religion that proclaimed the ultimate victory of purity over corruption, of salvation over exclusion, of life over death. The medieval period's obsession with demons, possession, and exorcism reflects a time when the creature's influence was particularly active, manifesting through individuals who had opened themselves to its essence through various forms of spiritual rebellion. The detailed demonologies compiled by Christian scholars were not fantasy but field guides, attempts to catalog and understand the various forms that the creature's influence could take. The Renaissance, with its revival of ancient learning and its celebration of human potential unlimited by divine boundaries, represents another major manifestation of the creature's educational program. The same promise that had been offered in Eden, "You shall be as gods," was being offered again, dressed in the language of humanism and scientific advancement, but fundamentally unchanged in its essential rebellion against created order. The modern age, with its unprecedented technological power, its manipulation of genetic codes, and its systematic violation of the boundaries between species, between organic and artificial, between human and machine, represents perhaps the creature's most successful manifestation since the antediluvian period. The very achievements that we celebrate as evidence of human progress begin to look suspiciously like preparation for the creature's final physical return. The environmental destruction that accompanies technological advancement, the social fragmentation that follows in the wake of innovation, the spiritual emptiness that characterizes materially successful civilizations, all echo the patterns that the ancient texts describe as characteristic of the creature's influence. We are not merely repeating history, we are completing it, bringing to fulfillment the program of corruption that began before the flood and survived the judgment that was meant to end it. The genetic engineering that now allows us to create hybrid creatures that violate the boundaries between species, the artificial intelligence that promises to transcend the limitations of human consciousness, the biotechnology that offers to remake humanity in whatever image we choose, all represent the return of capabilities that the antediluvian world possessed and that were specifically targeted for destruction in the flood. The difference is that this time, there is no Noah, no ark, no preservation of the pure remnant. The creature's essence has learned from its previous defeat and has ensured that when its final manifestation comes, there will be no escape, no refuge, no possibility of starting over with a cleansed creation. The ancient texts speak of this final period with a mixture of warning and inevitability. They describe a time when the creature's influence will become so pervasive, so normalized, so integrated into the fabric of civilization itself, that resistance will seem not just futile but incomprehensible. The majority of humanity will welcome the creature's return, seeing it not as the resumption of an ancient rebellion, but as the next stage of human evolution. Yet even in these darkest prophecies, there remains a thread of hope. The same texts that speak of the creature's survival and ongoing influence also speak of its ultimate limitation. It may have learned to survive its own destruction, but it has not learned to create. It can corrupt, influence, and manipulate, but it cannot bring forth new life. It can mimic the forms of creation, but it cannot capture its essence. It can exclude itself from salvation, but it cannot prevent salvation from being offered to others. The flood, therefore, was not a failure, but a demonstration, proof that divine power remains supreme even over corruption that seems absolute, that purity can triumph even when it appears overwhelmed, that salvation remains possible even for a creation that seems irredeemably lost. The sound of rain continues, but now it carries within it not just the memory of judgment past, but the promise of judgment to come. The creature that Noah didn't save serves as a reminder that some corruptions are too deep for rehabilitation, some rebellions too complete for reconciliation, some choices too final for reversal. But it also serves as a promise that such corruption, however persistent, however clever, however successful it may seem in the short term, is ultimately self-limiting. Evil may learn to survive its own destruction, but it cannot learn to create the kind of world that would make such survival worthwhile. It may exclude itself from every arc of salvation that divine mercy provides, but it cannot prevent new arcs from being built, new opportunities for redemption from being offered, new possibilities for transformation from emerging. The waters rise, the rain falls, and somewhere in the depths of that eternal storm, the battle between corruption and purity, between exclusion and salvation, between the creature that was left behind and the creation that was saved, continues to rage. The outcome of that battle may be foreordained, but the form it takes, the cost it exacts, and the lessons it teaches remain to be determined by choices yet unmade, by vessels yet to be filled or emptied, by souls yet to decide which side of the ark they will occupy when the final flood comes. The rain continues its relentless symphony, but beneath its familiar rhythm lies something else, whispers from the deep places of the earth, echoes of a covenant that was made not in mercy, but in necessity. As the ancient texts speak of the creature's transformation from flesh into essence, from presence into influence, we must confront the most chilling possibility of all, that its exclusion from the ark was not the end of its story, but the beginning of ours. The Coptic manuscripts discovered in the ruins of the monastery of St. Anthony, buried for centuries beneath the desert sands of Egypt, contain fragments that were never meant to survive the scrutiny of orthodox theology. These texts speak of what they call the teaching that continued in the deep, a curriculum of corruption that did not end with the flood, but adapted, evolved, and found new ways to reach the minds of those who thought themselves safe in the cleansed world. The beast that was denied the ark became the teacher of all who would learn to deny themselves salvation. One fragment records with devastating clarity. Its voice, no longer bound by flesh, could whisper to every creature that chose to listen, offering the same knowledge that had corrupted the first world, dressed now in new forms but carrying the same ancient poison. This understanding transforms every subsequent biblical narrative from simple moral instruction into chapters in an ongoing war between the influence that was excluded and the purity that was preserved. The serpent in Eden was not the beginning of corruption, but its first successful infiltration of the new world, the creature's essence finding its first post-flood vessel, teaching the same lesson it had taught before the waters rose, that divine boundaries were meant to be crossed, that forbidden knowledge was worth any price, that rebellion was not sin but enlightenment. The medieval Islamic commentators, working with texts that paralleled but often contradicted the biblical account, preserved their own fragments of this larger story. The Qisas al-Anbiya, the stories of the prophets, speaks of a creature that learned to speak through the mouths of stones, through the patterns of wind and water, through the dreams of those who slept too deeply. It had become, in essence, a kind of spiritual radio station, broadcasting on frequencies that only the corrupted could receive. The Byzantine chroniclers, writing in the shadow of a Christian empire that was slowly crumbling under the weight of its own contradictions, began to notice patterns in the collapse that echoed the ancient descriptions of pre-flood corruption. The same appetites return, wrote John Cantacuzinus in the 14th century. The same hungers that can never be satisfied. The same thirst for knowledge that transforms wisdom into poison. We see again the mixing of what should not be mixed, the crossing of boundaries that were established for our protection. The Renaissance, with its celebration of human potential unlimited by divine constraint, its revival of pre-Christian mystery traditions, and its systematic questioning of religious authority, begins to look less like intellectual awakening and more like the creature's most successful educational campaign since the antediluvian world. The same promise that had been offered in the garden, "You shall be as gods," was being repackaged in the language of humanism, scientific inquiry, and artistic expression. Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks, filled with designs for flying machines and anatomical studies that violated religious prohibitions against dissection, read like assignments from the creature's curriculum. His famous mirror writing, his obsession with hybrid forms that combined human and animal characteristics, his mechanical inventions that sought to transcend the limitations of created form, all echo the patterns of corruption that the flood was meant to cleanse. The printing press, celebrated as one of humanity's greatest achievements, takes on darker significance when viewed through this lens. It was not merely a tool for spreading knowledge, but a mechanism for disseminating the creature's influence on a scale previously impossible. The same technology that could spread the gospel could also spread the anti-gospel. The same networks that carried salvation could carry corruption. The rain grows silent now, but its echo remains, not in the air, but in the memory of what was chosen and what was left behind. As we step back from the edge of these ancient waters, from the forbidden texts and hidden testimonies that speak of corruption so complete it required cosmic surgery to remove, we are left not with answers, but with recognition. The creature that Noah didn't save was never just one animal among many. It was the embodiment of a choice that creation itself had made, the choice to become something other than what it was meant to be, to cross boundaries that were established not as limitations, but as protection, to seek knowledge that would transform the seeker into something that could no longer be saved. Perhaps the true lesson of the flood is not about divine judgment or ancient history, but about the eternal present in which that same choice confronts us still. In every moment when we stand at the threshold between purity and corruption, between the ark of divine protection and the rising waters of our own rebellion, we become either the saved or the excluded, the preserved or the forgotten. The sound of that first great rain continues to fall, not just in memory but in warning. Somewhere in the depths of our world, in the spaces between what we know and what we dare not discover, something still whispers the same curriculum of corruption that once turned paradise into judgment. The question is not whether we will hear it, but whether we will listen, and what kind of creature our listening will make us when the waters rise again.